Pete, we are excited to bring back a good friend of the show. David Jesse is the creator and proud father of Tatooine Sons, a pop culture podcast that explores Star Wars and other fan favorite franchises as the modern myths of our time. Each week, David teams up with his sons Nate and Sam to bring thoughtful, entertaining discussions to listeners across the galaxy. They're the only Star Wars podcast to both name a canon character and receive a personal endorsement from Rian Johnson. Not at all jealous about that. Please welcome back to the show our good friend, Mr. David Jesse.
There he is, David
What's
Jesse.
up, guys? We're going to milk that Turbis the Porg thing and Rian Johnson thing till the day we die.
As well you should.
Well, yeah, you absolutely should. I mean, this is not the time or place for the story again, but my goodness, It is so cool. It is so cool. I just, I mean, and then you have him on video.
We have him on video saying the endorsement.
So it's not just like we have a couple things by I can't think of his name. Mark, the voice guy who does all the books. Mark Thompson.
Mark Thompson, yeah.
Doing a couple intros for the show, but it's not the real Thrawn. It's Mark. No,
right,
not that Mark's.
Right.
I mean, he's close, but he's not it. So it's
pretty cool. That's a pretty cool voiceover, though.
Oh yeah, it's kind of one of my favorite things. So David, Tatooine Sons is back in business. Tell people a little bit about Tatooine Sons who may or may not have heard of it.
Yeah, it's a dad and two sons. We started this thing almost 8 years ago. Sam and Nate were 16 and 12 when we started. Now they're 24 and will be 20 in just a couple months.
Wow.
And so they've grown up talking Star Wars. And a few years back, we sort of pivoted to a full pop culture conversation and have been having a lot of fun with that over the last several years. And then we took a little bit of a hiatus starting in the fall of the year as Sam was finishing school or he had already finished. He was like moving into his full-time job. Nathan was getting ready to start college and then tried to figure out would we cancel the show? Would we like stop it because they had grown up, or were we going to keep doing it? And we decided not only would we keep doing it, but we'd pivot back to talking pretty much Star Wars exclusives. So that's we started that back up in May and a little bit different format, but it's a lot of fun. We're having a great time.
You got to keep it going until you get to Tatooine Grandsons.
I know. Yeah. that is sort of like, that always has been the dream, is like to have an episode where I've got all like 3 generations on the show. That'd be pretty cool. That'd really be a good show. So.
That would be awesome. So David, what was your first Star Wars memory and what made it instantly feel different from anything else you'd seen?
It's weird. There's 3 memories I think of when I think of Star Wars, because it came out when I was 2 years old, right? So didn't see it in the theaters in 77. I remember it being on loop on HBO when I was like 4 or 5. And that was my initial exposure to Star Wars, was seeing it like that. And just fascinated by this. I remember being bored to death through anything on Tatooine, like we all are, if we're honest. And then
jump to the cantina. That's when it
once Han shows up. I remember when Han, because he did shoot first.
Yes.
When he did, I remember distinctly wondering, is he a good guy or a bad guy up until the very end of the movie? Right. And when he shows back up to save Luke at the Death Star, I was like relieved and excited and because he was truly a good guy. So that's sort of an early memory. Playing action figures in the backyard with Marvin and Brandy and Jamie, my 3 friends that were on the cul-de-sac with us. We did that for years. And then I remember distinctly a Sunday afternoon when one of those guys showed up at the house and said that their mom was taking them all to go see Return of the Jedi and wanted to know if I could come. And I had a commitment that night with my family and I couldn't go. And I did not see a Star Wars in the theaters until the special editions.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, that's my earliest Star Wars memories.
Wow.
It's fantastic. So if, as we're talking tonight, we're talking about what makes a Star Wars, and we're going to kind of dig into that from a couple of different angles. So the first question I want to ask you is, if you had to describe the Star Wars feel in one word, what would that word be and why?
It's so hard because I think that the initial word that always comes to my mind is hope, but that's sort of overdone, right? I mean, everybody says that, and it's going all the way back to, I mean, it really became the word at the end of Rogue One when that hit the theaters and Leia says it. And I do think that that's, a word that describes it. But I would tell you that I feel the older I get, the more the word mythic really it sticks with me with Star Wars. There's something so big about that story, and it's why it's endured for almost 50 years. And it's, they're goofy old men like us on a Thursday night sitting around Star Wars every single week. Because there's something bigger than just a sci-fi franchise or a fun movie or something like that, and that's the word I would use to describe it.
It's funny you say that again. When I was writing for Star Wars Galaxy magazine, I was asked to speak at some local sci-fi thing, and I did a whole presentation on the modern day myth. And I started my presentation by saying that Star Wars is not science fiction. And I remember, like, there were people that were literally like, "Oh, you're wrong. You're dead wrong." But I mean, this is why Star Trek comes and goes. There's nothing in Star Trek, because I do love a lot of the Star Trek stuff. But it does kind of, it ebbs and flows because it does have some of the elements, but Star Wars is all those elements.
It's not the same.
It's not the same. Yeah. And it's really interesting. And I love that you said that it kind of hit that way, because we've had these conversations before. We've had these conversations as different shows have come out throughout the Star Wars, certainly in the Disney Plus era. David, I've heard you guys talk about this a good bit. Our friend Dan Zier talks about this a lot on Coffee with Kenobi. The fact, and this is even more prescient in my mind recently, because my kids are all obsessed right now with ancient Egypt and the pharaohs and Joseph and all these stories. We watched the 10 Commandments the other week. I watched 10 Commandments growing up, like, all the time as a kid.
Every Easter, right?
It was an epic movie. Yes, every Easter. And it was such an epic movie. And my dad, of all people who liked Westerns and Star Trek, he was like, we have to watch the 10 Commandments. But Star Wars has become, and I say this because there's so much of Egyptian mythology, my kids and the stuff, through the Thor and Loki movies, we've got Norse mythology. This is our modern American mythology that has interwoven itself into our culture. And we see it in so many ways, from people who, in one form or another, become actual adherents of some version of the Force as a guiding principle in their life. We have cons, we have celebration, we have Star Wars Day. Our baseball teams take on Star Wars special events like this. This mythology created by this guy from California, this story has become an actual mythology that has actually woven into the actual course of our lives. We get tattoos of it. It becomes this thing that is more than just, and people have Star Trek tattoos, like you said, Pete, but it's a different thing, and it holds in a different status, because when there's a news story, like we're going to get into later, about who's going to be in charge of Star Wars, like, it becomes front page news. It's not the same as if, they're making another season of Lower Decks. That's a different thing. So it's really fascinating. And I love that the word you chose is mythic, because it started out as a story influenced by myth and now has become a mythology all of its own.
Yeah. And, the other day, I think it was Monday, I was sitting in here in my office. I work from home. My office doubles as our podcast studio. It's nice now. I'm actually not in a 4x4 closet where I've been for the last 4 years. I had a son move out, so I get a room now for it. And I had a TV on, and there was some videos playing on a History Channel documentary from the time that Phantom Menace came out. I think it's called The Legacy Revealed. Came on, and it had, people talking about the mythology and how this ties in. And, it's stuff that we know. It's talked about like crazy and in the Star Wars world. But as I was watching it, I kept wondering, is that something that at this point in our world the timing that we're at, if we need more. We need more of this. There is a sense of right and wrong and good and evil. And there's a reason to stand up against, a tyranny and darkness. And we need to stand up against that. And so, that's something that I think that people gravitate towards these stories in the Star Wars universe, because they help us. I mean, we used to open our podcast for years with saying there's a story written on our souls and that these myths speak to that story. And that's exactly what I feel like Star Wars does.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think when people, I used to ask the question, why does Star Wars survive? And it's because of that. It's so much deeper than just a handful of movies. But so as we look at sort of the question of what makes a Star Wars, though, because now we've seen different iterations, as we've gone through Disney Plus, we've seen things that are, you see something like Andor, which is, is it fully Star Wars? What's it missing? Does it have everything? And you have things, all kinds of different types of stories. So in your opinion, what is sort of the essential elements of a Star Wars story that make it Star Wars?
And this is, as I answer this, I'm fully aware that 2 of the last 3 releases within Star Wars have blurred this line somewhat with it. But there really truly was, especially when you go back to the original trilogy, there was this clear delineation between who the good guys were and the bad guys were.
Right.
With it. And I think we get that in series like Andor.
Yeah.
We know who the good guys are. And even though we have guys like Luthen that are I think we talked about it when we were doing the Road to Rebellion show. They're terrorists, right? I think Colton said that.
Yep.
You made it that clear. They're terrorists and they're revolutionaries. But sometimes the cause requires you to take a stand in a violent manner. And I'm not trying, saying that like lightly. I'm saying that that's the way that story, it plays out with it. I feel like when we got to the prequels, we saw that there were good guys and bad guys. There was light and there was dark. There was good, there was evil. But we saw that there was, and I love it in the prequels, specifically that era. We see this group that should be standing on the right side every single time, and they're corrupted by the institutionalization of the Jedi Order and their marriage toward the political system. And we see the Jedi falling, in The Last Jedi, my favorite Star Wars movie, we see Luke talking about the hubris of the Jedi and be able to be corrupted with it. We see that falling apart with that. I struggled somewhat with the Acolyte because I struggled with who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. And really, is there this clear sense of right and wrong with it? And I think that that's one of the things that has always made Star Wars grab me. Is there really, you kind of know what side you're supposed to be rooting for with it.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because I've said this a bunch of times recently, especially as we've gotten into the Disney era of Star Wars, is in 1977, moviegoers, story receivers wanted and were more adjusted to simple stories. And I don't mean that to minimize it, but there's good guys, bad guys, and they were called rebels, but we didn't think of them as rebels as we think of rebels today. And it's interesting that Star Wars storytelling has grown with us as a result, right? In that the reason Andor is so good is because it explores those areas that, I don't think in 1977 we wanted to think of, Captain Antilles as a potential, connected to a terrorist organization, right? We wanted him to be the guy who did what he had to do with the droids and blah, blah, blah. So I think that that's part of this really unique growth is that, it's like Clone Wars. When we look at the Clone Wars episodes, they evolved with their audience, right? They started out as 10-year-olds, and by the time it ended, they were older, and the stories got more mature, and they
and Rebels was the same way. Absolutely.
Yes, for sure.
Was.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and it was easier when we were kids. And I think that's the other thing that we've talked about too. And you hit on it just a little bit. Even for those of us that grew up with the original trilogy, we grew up with Star Wars and Star Wars grew up with us. It was really easy as a kid to tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys, because the good guys were kind of this ragtag, run around, the cool ones. The bad guys all had clean, pristine armor. They all matched. It was big. It was scary. And then as we got older and we got things like DJ in The Last Jedi, and we get, these other characters, and he's going, yeah, guess what? Everybody's a bad guy because they're selling ships to the same people they're selling ships to.
Yep.
Because that's how life works for us in the real world. We have to grow up and we have to figure out how to make ethical choices, and we have to figure out who's a good guy and who's a bad guy, and where does that, for as much as I am not one who says there should be a gray Jedi, because I think we have dark side and we have light side, it also gives you that moment to pause to go, but that's where people come up with that, because you're going, what if you are a decently good guy, but we got a little bit of that in Visions. So I think that eternal struggle of light and dark, good and bad, good versus evil is a key crucial part of Star Wars, but we all get to engage with it at different levels in different ways. And I think it feeds into what we said earlier. It feeds into what makes this myth so endearing and lasting the way it does.
Well, and that's the beauty of where we're at in the production of Star Wars now, because it's not like we're going to have 3 movies, wait 10, 12, 15 years, 3 movies, wait 10, 12, 15 years. So those 3 movies don't have to just be all for 12-year-olds, as George Lucas said at the 40th anniversary of Star Wars panel in Orlando. It needed to be that way when it was just these trilogies coming out. It doesn't have to be that way now. And that's something that I've had to, over the last several years, come to grips with, that there can be stories like Andor, and there can be stories, as we talked about before, with the Acolyte and those types of things, because we get more of them now. I'm of the opinion that your cinematic universe should stay the big tent pole, full-on, family-driven, Star Wars is for 12-year-olds experience. And then I'm saying go to town on Disney Plus with Andor and with some Star Wars horror or whatever we need to do. Let us that have aged with it have content that tells a story to us today, so that we can continue to stay engaged. But let's be wise and realize that there should be stories like Skeleton Crew. There should be stories like Ahsoka to go alongside with an Andor, so that people at different stages of life, different maturity levels, and different preferences have the opportunity to engage in this universe.
Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about, Greg Iwinski, who's a friend of the show and a writer on the Young Jedi Adventures.
Jedi.
I mean, that is such a cool thing. I love that my son is a Star Wars, a Clone Wars kid. He's the Rex 5s and Cody guy. Like, that's his Star Wars, which is so amazing. And that's only a result of the fact that there's so much different things coming out. Because honestly, I didn't watch Clone Wars until he started watching it. And just because I was like, oh, it's a cartoon, I don't want, and I missed so much great stuff. but it's as you were just saying, it's like there's enough for everybody, and whatever gets you into the myth, that's great, right? So
yeah. I remember sitting there at when Mandalorian season 2 finale hit, and I'm sitting there with Sam and Nate, and so Nate I think was about 13, 14 years old, maybe 15. And we were sitting there watching that finale, and somebody showed up in an X-wing, and they were hooded, and they got out and they started just mowing down bad guys with a green lightsaber. And I'm sitting on that couch with him, 100% convinced, knowing it's Luke, and super excited to see Luke Skywalker return.
Yep.
And when it was revealed to be Luke, Nathan let out a disappointed sigh, because for him, he was convinced it was Ezra Bridger returning from the unknown regions. Because Star Wars for him was Rebels. And the ultimate Jedi, he'll argue to this day that the ultimate Jedi is Ezra Bridger. And a guy showing up with a green lightsaber to save the day had to be Ezra, and he was super disappointed with that. So I think that's interesting how it's changed for all of us as we ingest and take in Star Wars in different eras.
Yeah. Wow.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, another thing that changes within all of us at different eras and stages of our life is humor. And Star Wars has that nothing, if not always, had a lot of funny stuff in it. What do you think the role of humor in Star Wars, the weird, does that keep it feeling like Star Wars? Because we had so much stuff early on with, boring conversation anyway. I don't know. How are you? All that kind of stuff, all the way up through Fly Casual. And then in the prequels, when we have a younger audience, we have, Eopes farting and that kind of stuff. So talk a little bit about the role that you see, the crucial role of humor in Star Wars.
Yeah, humor makes perfect sense in context of what you were describing, especially with the prequels and Jar Jar and the Opie and that kind of thing. When you remember what George Lucas has said as he was making those movies, that Star Wars was for 12-year-olds. And if you're a 12-year-old kid watching The Phantom Menace and the Opie farts, that's great.
Laugh at it. Yeah,
that's great. Right? C-3PO was funny in the original, and adults didn't like him and kids did. And it's the same thing with Jar Jar in the prequels. And there was I think Ryan was attempting to go down some of the path of what you were using as an illustration there with like Han saying, boring conversation anyway, and some of that sarcastic humor with that opening sequence with Poe and General Hugs.
I love it. I think it's
fantastic. I love it. I thought it was hilarious.
I think it's so funny.
But I can understand where if you're going for, and this is the big debate now after Andor, if you gravitate as you've aged and you're a 30-year-old guy or a 35-year-old or 40-year-old person watching these things, that stuff's maybe not what you're hoping to see. You're hoping to see the Andor stuff. So that conflict is there. But I remember sitting next to Nate and Sam in the theater watching The Last Jedi, and they're cracking up at Poe, in that opening. And I think that's going to be critical to keeping it light. I think that's one piece that Andor never really landed humor well in the entire series. But it wasn't built for 12-year-olds. It was built for guys like us and people like us.
Yeah, no, it's true. And it, again, every time spending too much time on the internet, I hear we're exposed to the things that people think are dumb or the things that
way too much time on it.
Yeah. But then I'll go and watch that episode with my son, and I'll be like, "What did you think of that?" And he'll be like, "Oh, that was awesome." And I'm like, "Okay, so it worked. It worked for the right person."
Mission accomplished.
Yeah. So one more question before we take our break. What do you hope the future generations will take from Star Wars, or maybe bring to Star Wars as we go? As we talked about Tatooine grandsons, what are they going to be talking about when Star Wars is still around in 20 plus years?
That's a great question. I'm concerned that they won't, but I hope that there really is an appreciation and almost to an extent of a reverence for the original trilogy. 20, 25 years from now, it's not some 75-year-old movie that my grandpa watched and he made his kids watch. I'm hoping that they understand the way that story is there. I love how Andor, Rogue One, and then A New Hope changes the way that you watch A New Hope, and then it changes the way you view the Empire going forward and watching that trilogy. So I love that. I do, as much as I'm not a fan of the idea of CGI original trilogy characters, or even, I'm not even sure I want a ton of stories in live action being retold in that era. I do hope that they continue to tell stories in that era. I think that they need to, I would love to see Lucasfilm open up, loosen the reins a little bit for writers to write within that era more. I don't feel like they've given much latitude to do that. And maybe even I've often said that, after you go from Clone Wars, Rebels, Bad Batch, I think the next era is original trilogy era. I would love to do an animated story of stuff happening between A New Hope and Empire Return of the Jedi with the original characters, but make it animated, get great voiceover actors in there with it, and expand that story so that those generate. I just want this mythology. That's my hope for future generations. I want this mythology. I want there to be opportunities for parents to sit with their children and talk about right and wrong and good and evil from the perspective of telling a kid's story, because that's what they did for hundreds of years using other myths and other fairy tales. And this is our mythology now.
Yep. Yeah. 100%. Oh, that's so cool.